Let's continue with the carbon credit video. The developed country would be given credits for meeting its emission reduction targets, while the developing country would receive the capital investment and clean technology or beneficial change in land use. Under international emission trading, countries can trade in the international carbon credit market to cover their shortfall in assigned amount units. Countries with surplus amounts can sell them to countries that are exceeding their emission targets under Annex B of the Kyoto Protocol. These carbon projects can be created by a national government or by an operator within the country. In reality, most of the transactions are not performed by national government directly, but by operators who have been set quotas by their country. So let's learn about emission markets. Emission markets. For trading purpose, one allowance of CER is considered equivalent to 1 metric ton of CO2 emissions. These allowances can be sold primarily or in the international market at the prevailing market price. This trade and settle internationally and hence allow allowances to be transferred between countries. Each international transfer is validated by the UNFCCC. Each transfer of ownership within the European Union is additionally validated by the European Commission. Next is the climate exchanges have been established to provide a spot market in allowances as well as futures and options markets to help discover a market price and maintain liquidity. Carbon prices are normally quoted in euros per ton of carbon dioxide or its equivalent. Other greenhouse gases can also be traded but are quoted as standard multiples of carbon dioxide with respect to their global warming potential. These features reduce the quota's financial impact on business while ensuring that the quotas are met at a national and international level. Currently, there are five exchanges trading in carbon allowances: the European Climate Exchange, NASD82 OMX, Commodities Europe, Power Next, Commodity Exchange, Bratislava, and the European Energy Exchange. Offsets generated by CDM carbon project called certified emission reductions. Many companies now engage in emission abatement, offsetting, and sequestration programs to generate credits that can be sold on one of the exchanges. So, setting a market price for carbon. How to set a market price for carbon? Unchecked energy use and hence emission levels are predicted to keep rising over time. Thus, the number of companies needed up to buy credits will increase, and the rules of supply and demand will push up the market price, encouraging more groups to undertake environmentally friendly activities that create carbon credits for sale. Raising the price of carbon will achieve four goals. First, it will provide signals to consumers about what goods and services are high carbon ones and should therefore be used more sparingly. Second, it will provide signals to producers about which inputs use more carbon, such as coal and oil, and which use less or none, such as natural gas or nuclear power, thereby inducing firms to substitute low carbon inputs. Third, it will give market incentives for investors and innovators to develop and introduce low carbon products and processes that can replace the current generation of technologies. Fourth, the most important, a high carbon price will economize on the information that is required to do all three of those tasks. Through the market mechanisms, a high carbon price will raise the price of products according to their carbon content. How buying carbon credits propose to reduce emissions? We are going to answer that important question in a paragraph. So, carbon credits create a market for reducing greenhouse emissions by giving a monetary value to the cost of polluting the air. Emissions become an industrial cost of doing business and are visible on the balance sheet alongside raw materials and other liabilities or assets. For example, consider a business that owns a factory putting about 10 10,000 tons of greenhouse gas emission in a year. Its government is an Annex 1 country and enacts a law to limit the emissions that business can produce. So the factory is given a quota of, say, 80,000 tons per year. The factory either reduces its emission to 80,000 tons or is required to purchase carbon credits to offset the excess. After costing up alternatives, the business may decide that it is uneconomical or infeasible to invest in new machinery for that year. Instead, it may choose to buy carbon credits on the open market from organizations that have been approved as being liable to sell legitimate carbon credits. Who should consider the impact of manufacturing alternative energy sources? We. We should consider the impact of manufacturing alternative energy sources. For example, the energy consumed and the carbon emitted in the manufacturing and transportation of a large wind turbine would prohibit a credit being issued for a predetermined period of time. One seller might be a company that may offer to offset emissions through a project in the developing world, such as recovering methane from a swine farm to feed a power station that previously would use fossil fuel. So, although the factory continues to emit gases, it would pay another group to reduce the equivalent of 20,000 tons of carbon dioxide emissions from the atmosphere for that year. Another seller may have already invested in new low emission machinery and have a surplus of allowances as a result. The factory could make up for its emissions by buying 20,000 tons of allowances from them. The cost of the seller's new machinery would be subsidized by the sale of allowances. Both the buyer and the seller would submit accounts for their emission to prove that their allowances were met correctly. Now let's learn about credit versus tax. Carbon credits and carbon tax each have their advantages and disadvantages. Credits were chosen by the signatories on the Kyoto Protocol as alternative to carbon taxes. A criticism of tax raising scheme is that they are frequently not hypothecated, and so some or all of the taxation raised by a government would be applied based on what a particular nation's government deems most fitting. However, some would argue that carbon trading is based around creating a lucrative artificial market and handled by free market enterprises, as it is carbon trading is not necessarily a focused or easily regulated solution. By treating emissions as a market commodity, some proponents insist it become easier for business to understand and manage their activities, while economists and traders can attempt to predict future pricing using market theories. Thus, the main advantages of a tradable carbon credit over a carbon tax are argued to be: the prices may be more likely to be perceived as fair by those paying it. Investors in credits may have more control over their own costs. The flexible mechanisms of the Kyoto Protocol help to ensure that all investment goes into genuine sustainable carbon reduction schemes through an internationally agreed validation process. Some proponents state that if correctly implemented, a target level of emission reductions may somehow be achieved with more certainty, while under a tax, the actual emissions might vary over time. It may provide a framework for rewarding people or companies who plant trees or otherwise meet standards exclusively recognized as green. The advantages of a carbon tax are argued to be possibly less complex, extensive, and time consuming to implement. This advantage is especially great when applied to markets like gasoline or home heating oil. Less complex, expensive, and time consuming to implement. Perhaps some reduced risk of certain types of cheating, though under both credits and taxes, emissions must be verified. Reduced incentives for companies to delay efficiency improvement prior to the establishment of the baseline if credits are distributed in proportion to past emissions. Perhaps some reduced risk of certain types of cheating through under both credits and taxes. Emissions must be verified. Reduced incentives for companies to delay efficiency improvement prior to the establishment of the baseline if credits are distributed in proportion to past emissions. When credits are grandfathered, this puts new or growing companies at a disadvantage relative to both established companies, allows for more centralized handling of required gains. Worth of carbon is stabilized by government regulation rather than market fluctuations. Poor market conditions and weak investor interest have a lessened impact on taxation as opposed to carbon trading. Now let's learn about creating carbon credits. The principle of supplementarity within the Kyoto Protocol means that internal abatement of emissions should take precedence before a country buys in carbon credits. However, it also established the Clean Development Mechanism as a flexible mechanism by which capped entities could develop measurable and permanent emissions reductions voluntarily in sectors outside the cap. Many criticism of carbon credits stem from the fact that establishing that an emission of CO2 equivalent greenhouse gas has truly been reduced involves a complex process. This process has evolved as the concept of a carbon project has been refined over the past 10 years. The first step in determining whether or not a carbon project has legitimately led to the reduction of measurable and permanent emission is understanding the CDM methodology process. This is the process by which project sponsors submit through a designated operational entity their concepts for emission reduction creation. The CDM Executive Board with the CDM Methodology Panel and their expert advisors review each project and decide how and if they do indeed result in reductions that are additional. Additionality and its importance. It is also important for any carbon credit offset to provide a concept called additionality. The concept of additionality addresses the question of whether the project would have happened in the abundance of an intervention in the form of a price signal of carbon credits. Only projects with emissions below their baseline level, defined as emissions under a scenario without this price signal holding all other factors constant, represent a Net environmental benefit. Carbon projects that yield strong financial returns, even in the absence of revenue from carbon credits, or that are compelled by regulations or that represent common practice in an industry are usually not considered additional. Additionality and its importance. So, that is what additionality is meant. Carbon projects that yield strong financial returns even in the absence of revenue from carbon credits or that are compelled by regulations or that represent common practice in an industry are usually not considered additional. A full determination of additionality requires a careful investigation of proposed carbon offset projects. Now let's learn about the criticisms faced. The Kyoto mechanism is the only internationally agreed mechanism for regulating carbon credit activities and, crucially, includes checks for additionality and overall effectiveness. Its supporting organization, the UNFCCC, is the only organization with a global mandate on the overall effectiveness of emission control systems, although enforcement of decisions relies on national cooperation. The Kyoto trading period only applies for 5 years between 2008 and 2012. The cooperation, the first phase of the EU ETS system started before then, and it is expected to continue in a third phase afterwards and may coordinate with whatever is internationally agreed at, but there is general uncertainty as to what will be agreed in post Kyoto Protocol negotiations on greenhouse gas emissions. As business investment often operates over decades, this adds task and uncertainty to their plans. As several centuries of countries are responsible for a long proportion of global emissions, notably USA, India, China, have avoided mandatory caps. This can also mean that business in capped countries may perceive themselves to be working at a competitive disadvantage against those in uncapped countries as they are now paying for their carbon costs directly. A key concept behind the cap and trade system is that national quotas should be chosen to represent genuine and meaningful reductions on national output of emissions. Not only this ensures that overall emissions are reduced, but also that the costs of emissions trading are carried fairly across all parties to the trading system. However, governments of capped countries may seek to unilaterally weaken their commitments, as evidenced by the 2006 and 2007 national allocation plans for several countries in the EU ETS, which were submitted late and then were initially rejected by the European Commission for being too lax. A question has been raised over the grandfathering of allowances. Countries with the EU ETS have granted their incumbent business most of all of their allowances for free. This can sometimes be perceived as a protectionist obstacle to new entrants into their markets. There have also been accusations of power generators getting a windfall profit by passing on these emission charges to their customers. As the EU ETS moves into its second phase and joins up with Kyoto, it seems likely that these problems will be reduced and more allowances will be auctioned. While the carbon credit system can be an effective way to regulate carbon offsets by large institutions in large developed countries, it does not do enough to combat climate change in developing countries. Developing countries would be unlikely to adopt a carbon credit system to ca- curb their emission. Curb their emission. These countries often prioritize economic growth and poverty alleviation over lowering their fossil fuel use and carbon emissions rate. Nuclear energy could provide a more effective way to combat climate change while also supporting economic growth. By building and utilizing nuclear energy resources, these communities could create and use their clean power while also capturing carbon already present in the atmosphere. Next is about carbon tax. A carbon tax is a tax levied on the carbon content of fuels generated in the transport and energy sector. Carbon tax is intended to reduce carbon dioxide emissions by increasing the price of fossil fuels and decreasing the demand for them. Carbon taxes are a form of carbon pricing. The term carbon tax is also used to refer to a carbon dioxide equivalent tax, the latter of which is quite similar but can be placed on any type of greenhouse gas or combination of greenhouse gases emitted by any economic sector. When a hydrocarbon fuel such as coal, petroleum, or natural gas is burnt, its carbon is converted to carbon dioxide and other components of carbon. CO2 is the heat trapping greenhouse gas which causes global warming, which damages the environment and human health. Since greenhouse gas emissions from the combustion of fossil fuels are closely related to the carbon content of the respective fuels, this negative externally externality can be compensated for by taxing the carbon content of fossil fuels at any point in the product cycle of the fuel. Carbon taxes are a type of Pigovian tax. Tax assessed against private individuals or businesses for engaging in activities that create adverse side effects for society. Adverse side effects are those costs that are not included as a part of the product's market price and help to address the problem of emitters of carbon greenhouse gases not facing the full social cost of their actions. Research shows that carbon taxes effectively reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Economists generally argue that carbon taxes are the most efficient and effective way to curb climate change with the least adverse effect on the economy. 72 countries and over 100 have committed to achieve net zero global emissions by 2050. Carbon taxes have been implemented or scheduled for implementation in 25 countries, while 46 countries put some form of price on carbon, either through carbon taxes or emission trading schemes. To prevent them being regressive taxes, carbon tax revenues can be spent on low income groups. On 1 July 2010, India introduced a nationwide carbon tax of 50 rupees per ton of coal, both produced and imported into India. In a budget speech of 2014, the finance minister increased the price to 100 rupees per ton. In India, coal is used to power more than half of the country's electricity generation. India's total coal production is estimated to reach 571.87 million tons in the year ending March 2010 and expected to import around 100 million tons. The carbon tax expected to raise 25 billion rupees for the financial year 2010 to 2011. According to them, Finance Minister Pranab Mukherjee, the clean energy tax will help to finance a National Clean Energy Fund (NCEF). Industry bodies have not in favored the levy and fear that the resultant higher price for coal could trigger inflation. While many remain apprehensive, a carbon tax is a step towards helping India meet their voluntary target to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide released per unit of gross domestic product by 25% from 2000 levels by 2020. Environment Minister Jairam Ramesh told reporters in June 2010 that a domestic tax should come before a global carbon tax, and India has imposed one while others debate the issue. With the new government in India under PM Narendra Modi, the carbon tax has been further increased from 100 rupees per ton to 200 rupees per ton in the budget 2015 to 16. Currently, the carbon tax stands at 400 rupees per ton.